So I want to talk a little bit this afternoon about adaptive leadership and really thriving in a fragmented future, which is what the theme has been today. And it really is all about you as managers and leaders. We talked a lot about the technology. We've talked a lot about agile development. One of the things that I found kind of for a long time, but have talked about really over the last few years, is the agile community has been really good at talking to developers and testers and product owners and other people that are responsible really for delivery. But we've been a lot less effective at talking to managers and leaders about what their role is in a more responsive organization. So that's one of the things I want to talk about today. There are kind of two themes to what I want to talk about today. One is around technology. This was an IBM study that was done last year in 2012. Technology is the #1 concern of CEOs worldwide, of CEOs. In 2004, in 2006, in 2008, and in 2010, when IBM did this study, the #1 concern of CEOs were market factors. So last year, for the first time, it was technology. I mean, that's huge. It also goes on in this study to talk about the fact that CEOs need help in how they respond to the challenges of this new technology, and that's part of our job. The second theme that I'm going to talk about quite a bit is there's a book called The Upside of Turbulence by Don Sull that came out 3 or 4 years ago. And here's a sentence in this book that just kind of resonated with me, and I've talked about it and thought about it over the last couple of years. Companies don't pass through life cycles. Opportunities do. And if you think about it, Cindy Mitchell had a chart last year at this conference about the shortening time period for companies to leave the Fortune 500 companies, that the average length of time is something like 17 years, down from 50 years at the first of the century or something like that. So life cycles of companies are shrinking, but the life cycle of opportunities are really shrinking also. So I want to talk about managing the flow of opportunities in your organization, which is really part of what leadership is all about. So the adaptive leadership framework that I talked about last year at this conference really has 3 major pieces, and these are things that managers and leaders need to be thinking about. Really, how do you envision a responsive organization that can respond to the marketplace, that can respond to opportunities, that can respond to new technology? How do you help your organizations deliver a continuous stream of value? So continuous and value. And what are the aspects of that? And then how do you create an adaptive, innovative culture that helps you do that? So that's really the framework that I talked about last year. And what I'd like to do this year is kind of extend that a little bit and talk about 3 specific, more detailed things within each one of those. Number 1, delivering on ambitious missions. A lot of the things that we've talked about today and a lot of the projects that you've heard about today have been ambitious projects within an organization. We're not talking about the run-of-the-mill, everyday kind of thing. We're talking about the kinds of things that can make a difference in your organization. What are those really ambitious things that you're trying to do? Because those are the things that are really hard, and those are the places where adaptive leadership can really help. Number 2, and I won't talk about this too much, other than to go a little bit more into the IBM study and have a couple of ideas there, empowering technology. This last talk that we heard about in terms of just some basic technology that has really empowered social impact. And we've talked about some other ways in which technology can really empower organizations to survive the disruptions. It's interesting, right? And the technology today is really the disruptor, right, in terms of disrupting your businesses, but it is also the solution to that disruption. So we've got to look at technology from both perspectives. And then the last thing in terms of creating an adaptive culture is really how do we encourage disruptive thinking within our organization. So I want to talk a little bit about that. So if we're talking about ambitious missions, one of the things that it really required is to think about different ways of measuring success. I ask the question sometimes, how many of you have done agile projects where on the one hand somebody says, be agile, be adaptive, be flexible, but be on time and on schedule, right? It's sort of like, duh. And so I'll talk in a few minutes about really kind of a different model of looking at this thing. We've heard a lot about lean startup kinds of things today. There's a brand new book out called Lean Analytics. If you are doing any kind of web-based new projects and you want to find out the kinds of measures that you might be useful, get a copy of this book. Eric Ries's book on lean startup talks about innovation accounting, right? And so you kind of read through the book and say, okay, so where's the meat? And it's not there. The good idea is this is where the meat is in terms of analytics. And one of the things they talk about there is, Eric talks about is getting past vanity metrics. So for example, the number of hits on your website may be completely meaningless unless you really engage people on your website. So this is a really great book in terms of those kinds of things. I also talk about core business strategies. Several people have talked today about responsiveness versus efficiency. And I really think that those are two fundamental strategies for a business or for a part of a business. So you may need to go through and do an analysis in your business or in your part of the business is when push comes to shove, which is more important? It's not which is important and which is unimportant, but which is the more important to you? It's like one is the objective and the other one is the constraint. And both of those things are important. But when push comes to shove, which one is it? And in really pursuing ambitious missions, most of the time, the basic objective is responsiveness. Let me give you a couple of examples. Google and Walmart. So Google, the new eyeglasses, the Google glasses, right? They're always out there trying new things and new experiments and new projects and new products, and some of them succeed and some of them fail. But they're always out there trying to worry about the next thing, the next opportunity. Does Google worry about efficiency? Well, certainly in their server farms they do, right? They worry about efficiency. But as an overall company strategy, they're really more looking at responsiveness. As opposed to, say, Walmart, because Walmart is built around the philosophy of low cost. Low cost in their stores, which means low cost in their operations and really focused on efficiency. I've gone to many, many Agile conferences over the last 10 or 12 years. Until last year, I'd never seen anybody from Walmart, right? I've seen a lot of people from Google, so that's just one data point. Last year, some of their online people at Walmart have started thinking about Agile development. But let me give you another example from the Gap about responsiveness. And this is from Pat Reed, who's a friend of mine who was a director at the Gap. And so several years ago, they had this new product line that they came out with called Athleta. And it was high-end athletic wear for women. And it was an online brand, only sold online, right? So they got this up and running fairly quickly, and the brand took off. But their customers kept coming to them saying, we would like to see this stuff in a store. Right? So they said, okay, let's see if that's a real opportunity or not. Let's test this out. Let's do an analysis of this particular opportunity. And so they went to the stores people, right, whose job it is to build the 340-second store, right? It's not their job to build a prototype. And said, how long would it take to build a store so that we can test out this opportunity? And they said, well, about 14 months or something like that. And, to test out an opportunity to test out something, that's not a very good time period. So the head of the online division, who is basically bits and bytes kind of person, said, we can do it quicker. And so they did, because they'd been doing Agile for quite some time. They had that kind of Agile mindset throughout the organization, not just in the IT part. And they basically built a prototype store in about 4 months. They rented space up in Marin County. For example, one of the things they did is they didn't hook up to all the corporate accounting systems. They used QuickBooks, right? And they proved that those stores were really viable. And I was someplace a couple of weeks ago, I can't even remember where it was now, and I saw another Athleta store. So now, once they've proved out that opportunity, now they can begin to scale. So they go back to the people who are going to work on the scaling aspect of it. So that's one of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit later. It's a huge difference between startup and scale. And there's some really big issues there that everybody has to go through. So let's talk a little bit about value. I've got a couple of long quotes in here, which I try not to do in presentations, but I think these are really good quotes. What is business value? It's an informal term that includes all forms of value that determine the health and well-being of a firm. Business value expands the concept of the firm beyond economic, and I think that's a really important point. And it goes through all the different kinds of value, and then many of these forms of value are not directly measured in monetary terms. In fact, there was a book that was written about 10 years ago called How Leaders Build Value by Ulrich and Smallwood. And most of their data is a little out of date. It's about 10 years out of date, but I think it's still pretty valid. This is very interesting. As we go through the decades, the percentage of market capitalization or market value is more driven by intangible factors than tangible factors. So it's more driven by intangibles than it is by tangibles. And for example, the intangibles are not on the balance sheet, so you don't get credit for those in your balance sheet. There are things like innovation and brand name and leadership and patents. So for example, how much of the intangible value of Apple was due to Steve Jobs? Since he left, they've lost somewhere in the order of $200 to $250 billion in market capitalization. That's the impact of intangible values. And so it's not just dollars and cents or pounds or euros anymore. It's those intangible factors that are really important. And in fact, if you want to look at things like that, those are some of the things that contribute to value. So when I'm looking at projects or I'm looking at products, one of the things that I want to do is I want to introduce a different way of looking at projects or products than the old cost, schedule, and scope that we used to look at in project management. Because really what's important is this product delivering value to your organization? And there's a different question that you want to answer. If you're working on the old cost, schedule, scope, you ask the question, did you finish everything that was in the requirements document? That's how I know we're through, right? But you really want to ask a different question, which is, can I release this product today? Can I release this product at the end of this iteration? I don't care if I've got all the things done, but I want to ask the customers, can I release the product? Because if I can do that, I can begin getting value very early on. So the number one thing is, can we release value or release the product? Number two, quality. Is it reliable? Does it work today, and is it adaptable for the future? You know, on the scope, schedule, and cost kind of looking at projects, the question is, where's quality? And somebody says, well, it's in the middle, or it's in scope. But as we all know, it's not there, right? People don't really worry that much about quality. And then cost, schedule, and scope are really, really important, but they constrain. They're not objectives. They're constraints. My wife and I are building a new house, and I was talking to the builder last week. And I actually used this. I didn't tell him I was using this triangle, but I actually said, look, I said, number one, we want a house that is usable to us, that is the kind of house that has the kinds of stuff in it that we really want. So that's the most important thing. I said, number two, I said, we're really interested in quality building. So don't cut corners, right, in doing this stuff because we're going to be in this house for a long time. And by the way, I do have some cost constraints, but that's a constraint. That's not an objective. And I said, you know, and schedule is important. We want to be in, you know, before next winter. But some of these other things are more important. So you can use, you know, I've used this not just in a business sense. And so if you're looking at how do you evaluate business value, And I've blanked out the rest of this chart, and I'll show it to you a little bit later. You really might want to look at, so for example, this thing we're working on, the value dial is it helping us take advantage of some opportunity? And that may be really important if you're in the early stages of looking at opportunities. And some of these other things may be a little less important. You'll notice in this particular example, the financial impact is only 10%, right? The financials are not as important early on, particularly in a discovery or lean startup phase. So let's talk a little bit about opportunities. So we have, how do we look at value so that we can analyze opportunities? So this again is from Don Sull, this upside of turbulence. Companies don't pass through life cycles, opportunities do. And I define organizational agility, he actually uses that term, as the capacity to identify and capture opportunities more quickly than rivals do. So how do you manage the flow of opportunities in your organization? Opportunities are dangers, so it's both sides of turbulence. So I'm going to talk about a few things here. Identifying phases and processes, discovery, and talk a little bit about lean startup, and a couple of other things. And one of the things that's going to be important is how do you organize? So this is a takeoff on a figure by Don Sull. And so this axis is the age of the opportunity, and this is the life cycle. Don didn't have a discovery phase in his. The size of the bubble is the size of the investment you have to make. And then I've got some types in there that I'll talk about in just a few minutes. This is different than a pipeline in that opportunities come at you from all different directions. There may be business opportunities, there may be technology opportunities, and they go through this, you know, in the discovery phase, as Martin said earlier, you want lots of these things, you want to do a lot of experiments. Most of them are going to fail, but at least you're looking at many, many different things. Then you go through a startup phase and kind of the lean startup process you might use. And then scale and then mature. And so these different phases are sort of, discovery is how do you find the opportunities, right? There's a lot of stuff going on out there, but some people are not really looking very hard for the opportunities. Startup is really about confirming, do I have a customer? Do I have a product? Do I have a business model? No sense in scaling until you've answered those three questions, right? Because if you don't have a product and you don't have a customer or you don't have a viable business model, there's not really much use in scaling up. And so scaling is committing major resources to fulfill a mission. And then, of course, you've got maturity and decline. I really think there are different kinds of opportunities. And I think it's important to identify. You'll notice back on the previous diagram, I had these circles and I had differentiating in the middle. So what kind of opportunity are you looking at? Incremental, just, you know, that's what we do every day. We have incremental opportunities, incremental improvements to a product, incremental improvements to a process or a practice within our organizations. Differentiating. Differentiating is a significant improvement to a product or a process that's going to give you some competitive advantage for the short term. Might be 3 months, might be 6 months, but it puts your product out in front of the competitor's product for some short period of time. But it's not going to sustain for a long period of time because your competition is going to do that too. They're going to, you know, follow up. I mean, we all do product comparison checklists, and if we don't have X, Y, Z that the competitor has, we have to put that in. A disruptive opportunity creates an entirely new market or business model. So it is something, for example, like the internet, like social media, creates a whole new set of significant opportunities. One of the things that Don Sull talks about when he talks about opportunities as opposed to innovation is timing. That timing is really important when you're talking about kinds of opportunities. So for example, the big internet revolution was 2000 plus or minus a couple of years, right? And if you missed that, right? If you missed, for example, the transition from client-server technology to internet technology, you just didn't catch up, right? Because the competition got too far ahead. As seen from the CEOs, technology is #1 concern. We're in that kind of period again, in terms of really 4 critical things, right? Social media, big data and analytics, cloud, and mobility. And those opportunities are now. And in maybe 10 years it's going to be, or 5 years or whatever, there's going to be something else. But those are the opportunities from a technology perspective that are facing us now. And sometimes when we're in the middle of it, it's really hard to determine which are the things that are going to really be disruptive, right? And which are the things that are going to kind of pass us by. So I got to thinking about this idea of opportunities and how to sort of visualize for an organization what opportunities you might want to be looking at. And what I thought about was, I said, this is the ThoughtWorks technology radar, which many of you have probably seen, and I realize you can't read this, but I sort of had this, what about if we created kind of a customized opportunity radar for our organizations, in which we really said, okay, there's some management stuff that we might want to look at, business models, so we might try different business models, products and services, and technology. And so you would need to customize this for your own organization. What are the things we really need to adopt, right? We've done enough experimentation. We really want to go ahead with this. Which are the things that we're going to really go through some sort of trial period? We may do a kind of a lean startup with those. Which are the ones that are still sort of in the, we need to think about this kind of stage, this kind of thing, but we really don't want to do much with it yet except just sort of assess or hold. We're not, this is maybe something we really don't want to do much about right now. We just want to kind of put it on hold. We don't want to get rid of it, but we don't want to go any further with it. So this kind of a opportunity radar. During the startup phase, we're obviously going to do things like agile product delivery and some sort of lean customer product discovery process that we want to go through. And some of this stuff has already been mentioned. The Lean Startup, kind of the basic book by Eric Ries, Lean Analytics. Somebody did talk earlier about the Business Model Generation book. And there's a number of things by Steve Blank. Steve Blank is a professor at Stanford who really has been the catalyst for a lot of this stuff around the Lean Startup movement in his work with Eric Ries and some of these other people. So the Lean Startup is a good model for beginning to look at those opportunities, and it basically is a prototype. We're prototyping product, we're prototyping what customers we have, we're prototyping the business model to prove those things out before we begin to scale. So as we go through these various phases, what kinds of organization should we think about? So I'm going to talk about 4 different types of organization that you might want to think about here. So number 1 is change within an existing organization. And most of the time this would be for, sort of incremental opportunities that you might want to look at. Things that are going to be, an incremental change to your particular product. And so within each of these product divisions, we have some change going on, some opportunities going on. The second one is sort of a standalone. Somebody mentioned this earlier, skunkworks. What's the most famous skunkworks in the literature? Xerox PARC, right? In the 1980s at Xerox PARC, they came up with the basics for the mouse, for the Windows, all of the basic innovation that Steve Jobs and Bill Gates took advantage of came out of PARC, which was a Xerox company, and Xerox couldn't take advantage of it because it was out there in California and Xerox was in New York, and they just didn't take advantage of it. So there's some problems with this in that we can move all these product people over here and they can develop some stuff, but how are we going to integrate it back into the organization? But there have been a lot of successful kind of skunkwork projects that have gone on in organizations. I talked earlier about the fact that one of the huge issues is between startup and scale. And Jeffrey Moore, who's a Silicon Valley marketing guru who's written several other books, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Escape Velocity. And what he's basically saying is it's very, very, very difficult in big organizations to fund scaling. Because let's say you're talking about lean startup kinds of stuff, right? You're talking about experimenting with a bunch of opportunities. I can put 100,000 here, I can put 200,000 here, I can put 300,000 there. I can dole out hundreds of thousands, it depends on the size of your organization, $1 million here, $1 million there. Pretty easy to do. Now I've got one of these opportunities that needs $100 million to scale, and it's going to come out of your budget, right? That's when it gets hard, because the current operating plan just sucks all the money, right? And there's not enough money to reach escape velocity to get to that next place. And so Jeffrey Moore talks about that quite a bit, and the fact that it takes real leadership at the top to get past that, or you're really never going to get there with new opportunities. Which brings up the kind of next organizational type, which you'll see a lot of information or studies called an ambidextrous organization. I'm not sure where that title came from. I don't particularly like it, but that's where the research has been done. You'll notice that this looks remarkably like the previous one, right, which was a Skunk Works. Two huge differences. Number one, you'll notice that all of the functions needed to build and market that product are in the organization. So they're not dependent on the rest of the organization for marketing or operations or manufacturing or any of the other things. The second factor is it's way up in the organization. That new business unit reports to the president or some senior vice president. So it's very different from the previous version of a Skunk Works. Because in the Skunk Works, you typically don't have marketing, manufacturing, all of those kinds of things. The most famous example of this kind of organization was the building of the IBM PC in the early years. They took the whole organization. IBM was in Poughkeepsie. They took the whole PC organization, they put it in Boca Raton, Florida, gave them autonomy from the rest of the company. The problem with this kind of organization over time is that you have an organization over here that really is built around responsiveness. You have an organization here that's really built around efficiency, and they clash, right? And over time, what happened is the entrepreneurial spirit of the IBM PC organization got subsumed into the big organization. So the last organizational structure is a dual operating system structure. And this is actually pretty new. This was written up by John Cotter, who's a pretty famous change management specialist. And he wrote this article in Harvard Business Review last year. The greatest challenge that business leaders face is how to stay competitive against, among the constant turbulence. The existing structures and processes form an operating system that need an additional element to address those challenges, and that their solution is a second operating system devoted to the design and implementation of strategy/opportunity that uses an agile, network-like structure in a very different set of processes. So this is a dual operating system, not one organization that's kind of agile and adaptive and another organization that's efficient, but both of those combined into a single organization with different structures, different processes. And this is fascinating to me. This would be kind of the ultimate goal. It's very difficult to get there. So here is your ongoing business efficiency model, which is pretty much standard like we have it today. And then on the side, you have people from this organization that populate the dual operating system, and they volunteer for those positions. And that's very network structure, where this is more of a hierarchical structure. They call it a guiding coalition, or Cotter calls it a guiding coalition. It's a volunteer, so I volunteer for that. Self-organizing, right? Agile in terms of self-organizing teams. It is oriented towards strategy, and I would put in there managing the flow of opportunities as part of that strategy. So I have people that on one side are, or one part of the head is they have to manage an ongoing operation and be efficient and effective about that. And the other side of their head, when they're dealing with a strategy, they have to be adaptive and flexible and those kinds of things. And so finding those people in which can do both of those things might be a little difficult, probably is a little difficult, but if you can manage that, then you've got the best of both worlds. I would say that this is kind of as a model to kind of go for. And then you've got all of these people who are operating in this dual operating system who are all the change agents, and then Carter's got an 8-step program. So people ask me all the time, for example, in an Agile transformation, should we have a separate organization that does Agile, or should we integrate it into our basic organization? And the answer is, it depends, right? Typical consultant answer. But at least you have several models that you want to look at, and depends on what kind of organization and what kinds of responsiveness you kind of need within your organization. And then those things are going to flow through into when you do portfolio management for projects and products, you really need to be looking at different kinds of things than you probably look at today in your portfolio management. So what kind of opportunity is it? You probably look at size now, but are you looking at value? You may look at things like a whole different set of value things, release cycles, exploration factors, different kinds of things in portfolio management. And I'll put up the rest of that chart that I put in earlier in terms of a business value points matrix. And you'll notice, for example, as you go from phase to phase to phase, when you get over to the final define phase, maybe 75% of the value of a product or a project in the decline phase has to be financially justified. Whereas if you're in the discovery phase, it's, can I take advantage of this opportunity? The financials are much less important. So as you go from phase to phase, the way you evaluate value changes to accommodate the phase that you're in. Now, is this important? I would say that one of the companies who touts really being agile, Steve Green, who is the VP of technology for Salesforce.com, he's now left and gone to Twitter, but they implemented Agile more than 5 years ago. Look at this. They were ranked #1 innovator by Forbes magazine in 2011 and 2012. The #1 innovative company in the world. 5-year average sales growth of nearly 40%, 5-year average net income growth of nearly 80%. Would any of you sign up for those numbers if you could do them for your companies? And again, Steve attributes a lot of that to building an Agile organization, not just an Agile software development staff. So, managing the flow of opportunities, and a lot of those opportunities are going to be caused by, and your reaction to those are going to be technology. Just to go a little bit further with the CEO study, the CEOs expected technology to drive the most change in organization over the next 3 to 5 years. So the CEOs worldwide, and they talked to 1,500 CEOs or something like that, CEOs are concerned about this change and what they're going to do about it. And so there's a lot of impetus at the top of many of our organizations to try to figure out what to do. And it's interesting, I went on the ThoughtWorks website and picked off some things from the ThoughtWorks website, just kind of an idea of some of the opportunities that we're working on with people around the world. And you'll notice one thing I talked about earlier, mobile, cloud, social, analytics, big data. A lot of it involves those different kinds of technologies, and also the solution in terms of using things like continuous design, cloud analytics, agile delivery. So part of that is taking advantage of those opportunities quickly. So what about technology? Well, I'll go back to our technology radar. I know all of you can read that. So this is just the kind of stuff we have on our most recent technology radar. So which ones of these do you need to be looking at for incremental opportunities? Which ones of these do you need to be looking at for, I can help differentiate my product by doing one of these things, and which ones of these might be disruptive in your marketplace. And so there's a lot of analysis of these kinds of things. Now, this is just technology, right? But there's business models, there's processes, there's practices, there are a lot of other opportunities that you have to look at too. The one that's been talked about quite a bit today, and so I won't go over it in much more detail, is this whole idea of expanding. You know, in the early years in the Agile community, we mostly did iterative, continuous development. And then over the last few years, we've really been talking more and more about continuous delivery and actually getting it out into production very quickly. And now the talk is actually coming back to the front end and saying, we've got to be able to do all of this pretty quickly. We've got to do the continuous discovery, the lean startup kinds of stuff. So in your organization, one of the things that you have to do is as you go through different phases and as you look at different kinds of opportunities, you really need to be matching what is our continuous delivery cycle look like for this kind of opportunity. Does it need to be a day? John talked about, you know, some of the analytics work they were doing, and they actually have daily cycles. So what's the development cycle and what's the release cycle that really is appropriate for the kind of opportunity? And so it's different for different kinds of opportunities. So you might want to have one team over here that's working on, you know, a 1 month cycle. You might have another team over here that's working on a 1 day cycle. You might have another team over here that's working on a Kanban cycle. So you need to match those kinds of things to the opportunity and not just one size fits all, which is really part of Agile. This was just an example of continuous delivery, and I put this up here because it was continuous delivery in a large-scale development effort. 400 people. This was at Hewlett-Packard in a firmware for their printer series. It's actually, if you're doing large-scale, Agile, big projects, this is a book well worth getting. It was just written by the guys who actually did it. Gary Groover, who's somebody I know who's not at HP anymore, but was kind of the manager in charge of this project. And so this is, as I say, this is a book from the guys in the trenches that actually did it, as opposed to consultants like me, right? So it's a really interesting look at large-scale development. So let's talk a little bit about disruptive thinking. How many of you have, I don't know exactly, 8 to 14-year-old daughters? So you know about, or may know about, Little Miss Mismatched. Any of you? Okay, there's a couple out there. I read about this in a disruptive thinking book, and I thought, wow, how cool. So these guys sitting around a table one day talking about clothing, and they said, why should socks have to match? And they came up with this idea of mismatched socks. And by the way, they were going to put 3 in a package, not 2. And this kind of thing took off with young girls. And they made a whole industry out of this idea of mismatched socks. Interesting. Zipcar, right? Rent a car for a period of time, right? They have zip bikes around here. I don't remember what they call them, right? But in many big cities, you know, they have bicycles you could rent. So this was Zipcar. So there are different kinds of disruptive thinking. The interesting thing is a lot of the disruptive kinds of things are not secret. Kodak invented the digital camera, right? Last year, Kodak filed for bankruptcy. They could not take advantage of that opportunity early enough or scale fast enough. All the money was going into their film business, and they couldn't get away from that film business and get enough money and enough talent and enough resource put into digital to make a go of it. Borders in terms of books, we've talked about BlackBerry already, so we don't need to talk about BlackBerry. But if you really want to take advantage of these opportunities, if you really want to manage this flow of opportunities and figure out which ones are going to be really effective for you, you've got to have people in your organization or people that you work with outside your organization who can come in and make you feel really uncomfortable, right? A lot of these people, you are not going to like what they say, you're not going to feel comfortable with them, and you got to get over it. So disruptive thinkers see the same information, they interpret it differently. They're not satisfied with the status quo, they're looking for big wins. And they want to challenge your mental models about things. And they also challenge their own mental models, right? So this idea of disruptive thinking, of thinking about things in a different way, of coming up with new ideas, right, is really important. Because you got to have a lot of these opportunities out there in the discovery realm in order to narrow it down into things that you really want to do lean startup and scaling with. It sounds easy. You have these opportunities and you go through a lean startup process and it sounds pretty easy. But how do you decide? I've got thousands of technology opportunities. I've got hundreds of business opportunities. How do you decide which ones of all these opportunities you're really going to manage? And there's a number of things that are important, but I really want to focus in on one of them, which is another theme of sort of adaptive leadership, which is it's all about paradox. It's all about trying to hold two different ideas in your mind at the same time, according to F. Scott Fitzgerald, and still retain the ability to function. So it's the difference between a problem and a paradox. We like to think of things as problems. We go in, we analyze the problem, we figure out what we do it, and it's gone. Companies are not that simple. Centralization or decentralization, for example. And the answer is, it depends. It's a paradox. A paradox does not have a solution. A problem has a solution. A paradox has a resolution at some point in time for some set of things or some conditions. So, for example, invest in new startups or scaling. That's not a problem, that's a paradox. Focus on short-term or long-term. Well, if I'm about to go into bankruptcy, I better be focusing on the short term. And so a lot of the kinds of things that we're talking about in terms of opportunities, in terms of managing organizations through this process, is to look at these things as paradoxes, not problems. And there are issues that you're going to have to revisit again and again and again over time. You're going to have to resolve that paradox over time, multiple different ways. One of the ways of doing that is to take the Agile Manifesto approach. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. A lot of people have interpreted that to mean processes and tools aren't important. The very fact that processes and tools are up there in the manifesto statement says they're important, right? It just says individuals and interactions are more important. So it's a degree, it's a way of helping to make tough decisions. And you might have similar kinds of things. In 2013, in our current situation for our company, division, whatever, we prioritize startup funding over scaling funding, or adaptability over predictability, or responsiveness over efficiency. So we're trying to give some people some ideas about directionally what's more important in terms of paradoxical decision making. And I'm getting the high sign here. So thriving in a fragmented future, for ambitious missions, we have to rethink our success measures. We have to manage the flow of opportunities that are coming in the door and flowing through our organization. We need to engage with empowering technology. And really, we are beyond the point where non-IT, non-technology managers can say, that's their problem. Technology is your problem if you're in an organization, and you've got to learn to deal with it. You can't be a marketing, manufacturing, whatever kind of manager anymore and say, I don't want to deal with information technology. We have to encourage disruptive thinking, and we have to learn how to manage paradoxes that are really the keys to getting through and getting our organizations to make the right kinds of decisions. And with that, thank you very much.